going to try to get everything in here in an hour. So if you have any questions, by all means, please ask. I'll try to get to them, and we'll go from there. So when I was talking about technology, what's happening? We are now that, a goldfish. And you'll say, why a goldfish? Well, a goldfish's attention span is about 7 seconds. There's debate, 6, 7, or 8. But our attention span is a lot shorter. It's shorter now than a goldfish. So what does that say? There's a lot of neurotransmitters that are happening within our brain. And anytime you talk to someone, whether it be a witness, whether it be a suspect, whether it be a victim, they all are facing the same challenges. We are facing the same challenges. Is that how do we communicate effectively with people today? Well, one of the things that's happening is our brain. So what do we have? The limbic system. So if anyone remembers going back on evolution, but the limbic system is basically our fight and flight system. It's our freeze. It's ingrained in our biology. But in that limbic system, there's a little almond-shaped part of it called the amygdala. And why is the amygdala important? Because that produces a lot of our fight and flight. It produces our norepinephrine and cortisol and a lot of different neurotransmitters. It also encodes trauma. It also helps with the hippocampus and memory. And that's important because today as investigators, we want everything in a sequential order. We want everything starting from 6 a.m. to, let's say, the end of the day. And when we do that, we want everything and we want every fact, and we keep asking that person. However, research suggests, and what our neurobiology tells us a little thing differently, because we all remember things differently. For example, you could put 4 people that witnessed the same thing but have 4 different stories. Why is that? It's because the way our memory works is differently for every person. And as I get into a little bit more of NLP in a couple more slides, it'll make a little bit more sense. So when we talk about cognitive interview and standard interviews, cognitive interviewing is encouraging witnesses to recreate the original context using open questions. They are using cues to improve memory recall. For example, I'll give you this, is that like the sense of smell. The sense of smell is very important in the amount of recall. Everyone here, probably on this webinar, can think of a time that they were either out drinking and they drank something and then they smelled something again. But also, it's something that memory brings you back to. Like for me, for example, when I smell tomato sauce, it brings me back to when I was 8-year-old coming off the beach. And sometimes those are access cues in just certain olfactory senses. But the idea is that we have to do things differently, and technology is changing that. Our attention span and getting people to focus because of all the neurotransmitters that are going on. So when I talk about neurotransmitters, there's several neurotransmitters that I'm talking about. Specifically, dopamine. There's dopamine, serotonin, but for the purposes of when we're interviewing someone, dopamine impacts us. And it impacts us in a way that it controls communication to the brain. It's a neurotransmitter that helps control the brain's reward and pleasure centers. For example, have you ever tried to talk to someone and they're busy looking at their phone? I'm sure today everyone has. That phone, according to the CDC, is now they're coming out with addiction to cell phones. So whether it's a drug or alcohol, dopamine acts in the same way. So what dopamine does is that you, for example, let's say you go to your likes or your views. You need that continually confirmation and validity in order to uh, keep on something. So now when you're talking to someone, it's important to understand that's going on through their brains. It's going to be a little bit more difficult to communicate with them. Other neurotransmitters that are good, for example, serotonin. Serotonin helps you regulate your mood naturally. It makes you happier, calmer, more focused. If you ever with a group of friends and you were doing a fun activity together, that's a result of serotonin. And then you have oxytocin. And oxytocin is very important. It's very important because it's the power of touch. It regulates social interaction, sexual production, but oxytocin is the hormone that underlies trust. Today, individuals aren't getting serotonin necessarily or getting oxytocin. What they're getting is they're getting a lot of dopamine. So whether it be a witness or a victim, as you interview someone, they're addicted to that device looking for that continued validity. So in order to get through to someone, it's going to be a lot more difficult because today we don't have this, today we have the distractions that we didn't yesterday. Now, this is what happens to everyone. We have all this information coming into our brain. So we'll have an event, whether we witnessed the event, whether we were a suspect, whether we took part in it. And what I'm talking about today applies to people. It applies to biology and neurobiology. So, for example, if you were on trial and you had a jury trial and you were talking to the jury basically is going to look through their set of eyes in every single circumstance. So when I talk about building rapport a little later, I'm specifically talking about rapport with the jury. You got to remember, everyone has the same thing where it comes to our biology. We have all this information coming in. So we delete, we distort, and we generalize. And what do you mean by that? Is that basically is that we filter our experience, is that we have so much information that we can't categorize. So we delete it, we distort it, generalize it. Distortions when we make shifts in our experience of sensory data. For example, is if I went to Target, for example, and I had a bad experience and I came out of Target and I said, you never want to go to Target again because it's horrible. Well, I just distorted it because maybe I had a bad experience. So I have to ask questions. So specifically, why is Target very bad? Well, I was in line and it took forever. So is Target bad because of the wait? What happens is that our minds just distort it and we generalize it. It's all of a sudden you have a coworker who comes in late and he's late 2 or 3 times. We generalize saying, well, he doesn't care about work because he's late. Meanwhile, he was having difficulty dropping his children off to daycare. So we always do that, and with that becomes a belief. So now we're going to interview someone, and we're going to speak to other people, and we have to keep in mind that people delete, distort, and generalize all the information. Is we have all this information coming in, and this is kind of what neurolinguistic programming is. So we have these values, we have beliefs, we have decisions, and we have memories. And these all impact our thought process. And there's a lot going on cognitively when we're trying to communicate with someone. For example, is that when we talk about words we utter, there's a lot on the surface structure. And we have all these other beliefs, attitude, values, and feelings. Let's say, for example, you're interviewing someone who has a negative experience with law enforcement. Now, all of a sudden, when I try to talk to that individual, I have to get past that belief or the distortion, let's say, or generalization that all law enforcement is bad. So in order for me to break down that communication, I have to get through that cognitively. And there's other ways to do that through rapport and flexibility. There are so much that happen in someone's life, and that goes even for trauma too, is that when we, especially victims, and we have trauma encoded, we don't realize all the things that they've experienced and what they encode in their memory. And that memory being encoded is something that we have to get over. A lot of times we want the information like really quick, and I'll use this for victims. For victims, we have to, in order to get all that information that is in there, we have to go about it a different way. And we're just trying to get information and facts, let's say as law enforcement, trying to move the investigation forward or to get what we want. And the issue is that we have, everyone's different. So the way they remember it and their values and their belief system impacts what they think. So when we talk and we communicate, words only account for 7% of communication. Our tonality accounts for about 38%, and our physiology or body language is 55%. So let me ask you this. Who here in this audience has had difficulty with an email, for example, or a text that has gone awry? Whether you try to put all caps or you try to put what information that you have in there, words are only 7% because we're losing the tone, the tonality, the body language. And today, in a world that is filled with texts, emojis, and all different type of digital communication, it's very easy to miscommunicate. I can't tell you how many times where I've spoken to someone where I've gotten an email or a text and, well, that's not what I meant by that. And how do we do that? How do we find out exactly what was meant? We have to ask questions because it's, now think about this. Let's say you had difficulty with someone or a coworker, and now you get that text. So your prior experiences, your prior values and belief system, now you get a text. Now all of a sudden you are believing that text is more negative based upon your values and your belief system as you delete, distort, and generalize, and it's not what that actually person intended. So we jump to that conclusion that this person is saying A, B, and C when they're actually not. Does it make sense? So when we're talking about communication, the communication model is this. It's visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, and gustatory. It's the words we use. Predominantly, we use one more than the other. For example, we might be auditory, we might be more visual, we might be kinesthetic. And it's important when we're talking about even words, how we speak to people. And if you listen, you can tell whether that person is visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. You'll see by the words that they use. And that's important because when we're matching and mirroring someone, matching the modality or the actual words that they use will be important not only in establishing some commonality, but rapport. Words have different meanings for different people. Their meanings are based on their values, global culture, internal representation, and experience. And that's something very important to understand. How many times have you spoke to someone where they've mentioned a word and that word meant something different than it meant to me or you. And it's important that we understand that because words, again, are only 7%. So if we're talking to someone or we're communicating digitally, again, this is important. A lot of the things that I'm talking about here in this webinar are foundational. While I'm talking about cognitive interviewing, the reality is it's communication. And this is a base for it. Language crafts reality. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And that's sometimes where people, again, take one word and it means something completely different to them. Again, that's based upon our internal representations, our belief system, our culture, and everything is something different to them. That's why it's very important to use tone, tonality, and language, or not language, or body language rather. Again, meanings are in people sometimes, not words. So when I'm talking about visual words, now these are very important. Here's some cues, is that visual people tend to be more organized. They tend to be neat or well-groomed. They often have trouble remembering verbal instructions and are bored by long verbal explanations. Why is all this important? Let's say your influence. So whether you're a supervisor, a subordinate, a parent, a child, the world we have become comes about how we can influence someone. Whether we're talking to a witness to influence them to get that information that we need in order to prosecute something, whether we need to influence a jury that what I'm telling you is the truth, how we influence a suspect into providing us the truth of what happened. So this is really important. So you have visual, and these are some visual words. I'll give you some visual words in a minute. You have auditory. Auditory is someone whose auditory will move their eyes sideways and also down to the right. They breathe from the middle of the chest. They can repeat things back to you easily. Who here, and if you think about it, there's people here in this webinar that probably need to see something to understand it, need to hear something to understand it. And some people need to see it, hear it, and then do it after it to understand it. So auditory, they memorize by steps, procedures, and sequence. Again, everyone has something where it's more dominant. We will all have a little bit of auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, but predominantly we'll have more than one than the other. And that's important when we match and mirror and we use modalities. Kinesthetic. Their posture, believe it or not, would be often more slumped over. And they often move and talk very slowly. They typically access their feelings and emotions to get a feel of what they're doing. Think about this. Anyone remember have to feel something in order to understand it, in order to grasp it? They respond to physical rewards and touching. One of the things that I'll get into later with rapport, touch is very important when it comes to rapport. Okay, here are some visual, auditory, and kinesthetic words. As you can see, visual words are see, look, bright, clear, picture, foggy. Auditory, sound, resonate, listens, silence, deaf, squeak, hush, roar. Kinesthetic, I grasp, feel, feeling. Here are some examples. Let's look at it differently. See how this works for you. I can't quite picture it. That rings a bell. Clear as a bell. That's music to my ears. These are all things that we say, but we say that predominantly is because it tells us kind of what modality we could be in. that feels right to me. I can't get a grip on this. Get in touch with. Now, when you're interviewing someone, for example, when I talk to someone and they're using a modality, I'll listen to if they're kinesthetic, auditory, or visual. I'll see what kind of words that they use, and then I'm going to use the same words in order to match that. For example, is that when someone says, hey, do you see what I'm saying? And I say, I can't hear you, you're talking two different modalities. So the most important thing in any communication and interviewing is listening. Listening skills are important. As I get into some slides later on, sensory acuity is important because we want to see everything that's going on there in order to kind of calibrate what the other person is talking to. Great interviews are able to calibrate to that person. Every person is different, but rudimentary, there's things that are based on neurobiology. Okay, so today we have changed a lot. We have this technology going back and forth. And the idea is this is what we have to try to get over. This is the hurdle. Words do have power even though they're only 7% because of the meaning that words mean to the individuals. That's what's something that you need to understand is that even though words are only 7% of the way to communicate, certain people in certain words have a complete meaning system to someone based upon their experiences. So if you're interviewing a suspect or a witness, that word, if that word is traumatic to them and that word is powerful to them and you keep using that word, again, you're not going to be able to break down because that word has already been ingrained or has some associations with their memory through the hippocampus and then the amygdala. Does anyone know what any of these acronyms are? You know it's bad when you actually have to go to your 13-year-old son to find out what something means, or Google, right? So we have BRB, OMG. We're so quick, we're so busy. Back to the goldfish. That is a challenge that we all have to overcome when we communicate because we're moving so fast that we're missing things. Because we're trying to get the information and move on. Like anything else, it's not the quantity, it's the quality that counts. It's the actual act of listening to seeing what's going on. But today, because of this, it makes it difficult. So, story, I went to a restaurant not too long ago, and there was a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, mother and father. And while they were sitting there for dinner, they picked up their phones, and in 1 hour and 52 minutes, the only time they spoke is when they talked to the waitress to order food. Now, let's say that this family of 5 you have to interview. You're going to have to overcome the dopamine rush of their phones, the attention span. You're going to really have to work hard in developing rapport because if you don't, they are so glued to their devices, it's going to make it difficult for them in order to understand. So we have emojis. Emojis were brought in basically for the emotional or the 55% of communication that's body language. At least that in tonality, we can understand that and get that. Now, for me, I'm continuing. People send me emojis, and I am looking up them on Google. I think Google and the Urban Dictionary have been my best friend lately. But that's the reality is because people are communicating and what do they mean? Corporations actually started taking emojis out of business communication, and now they've put them in there because that's today how people communicate their emotion. So suffice to say, the interview trainings that we've had from the 70s and 80s and 90s, it's changed because technology has changed our neurobiology. we have so much more going on, and it's much more difficult for us to reach people. And that's what it's about. It's about reaching people. It's about understanding what's going on cognitively, coming up with a course of action and a plan in order to effectively communicate with that person. And whether it's a jury and you're testifying in a deposition, a trial, a grand jury, everything is people. And how you relate to people and how you build rapport with people is very important. So we talk about communication, nonverbal and verbal. Again, nonverbal communication is pretty much everything. Communication without the use of spoken language. It's your gestures, your facial expressions. Again, it varies from person to person. And in this webinar, I'm throwing a lot of information at you in a short amount of time. But the reality is that there's a lot going on with us today, and everything's a lot more complicated. And the more you're able to get in tune with the person that you're communicating with and looking for those cues, the more likely you're going to get that person to communicate with you. Nonverbal communication includes tone of voice, rate of volume in speech. I tell this story, just about, I'm from the East Coast. I talk very fast. But when I go to meetings and I meet people throughout the country, I'll change my rate of speech. It'll change and it'll slower because if I go Midwest and I go down to the South, I'm talking way too fast. So rate of speech is very important. How we articulate our words, our facial expressions. It's about congruency. Does our facial expression and our body language match what we're saying? In a lot of instances, those are why there's cues for deception. The following are some examples of body language and what each example communicates to other people. Arms crossed over the chest, nail biting, tapping or drumming to the fingers, touching the nose. That's a big one for deception. And the reason is that, again, the limbic system, what it does in your brain, when you're being deceptive and you're really worried about something, blood rushes to your nose. So if you ever notice someone going to their nose a lot, again, that's an indicator. And the reason is, again, it's biology. This is ingrained in that limbic system. So as we evolve, the more information that we have and the more things that we've experienced is that there are certain systems within our brain that actually are specific to individuals based upon what they've gone through. Do me a favor. Can everyone just read this? I know it's a little more difficult, but I'm going to give everyone here a minute to tell me how many F's are on the screen here. Take 30 seconds. Okay. Some people say that there's 3 F's on the screen. Some people will say there's 4. Some people say there's 5. And a few people say there will be 6. The answer is 6. Because what happens is we forget the ofs on the screen. So finished files are the result of years of scientific study combined with the experience of many years. So a lot of people will say 3 or 4 because people miss the ofs. The reason for that is our brain moves at such a fast pace that we miss things. And this is true when we're conducting interviews. It's true when we're communicating with people because our brain is telling us something so quickly that we miss things. So that's something very important to realize, is that our brain cognitively, we're going to miss things. So nonverbal communication, as I was talking about, again, our postures, our face, the way we look. You ever talk to someone or look at someone and they just had some type of look? So what happens is there's certain things we can't hide, for example, from the rubbing of the nose from the neurobiology. This I like, and this is important. Deception and our emotion, a lot of us try to hide things as best as we can. But one of the most difficult things to hide is our legs and our feet. It's because that's, again, limbic system-wise, it's the thing that we have the least amount of control over. So there's things that we'll miss. For example, I was in jury duty and the other day, and I love jury duty just because it's just fascinating because there's people. One of the things that I love is that I'm just curious about people in general. So it was an aggravated assault case against a police officer, which, by the way, I think I lasted 2 minutes before they got me off the jury. But when I was sitting there, they were reading the charges to the suspect. And when they were doing that, he was looking at the jury. He was dressed up in a nice suit. He had a nice smile. But underneath the table, the way his feet were, and his feet were crossed at his ankles, was an indicated that even though he was controlling his whole upper body movement, his legs were giving him away. If you ever notice, and even in an interview room, you'll notice where you're talking to someone and their feet are pointing towards the door. Again, that's subconsciously. The reason for that is that they're looking to get out and leave. Or there's times where you ever notice their feet and legs start pointing towards you as you're getting closer to something. For example, closer maybe to an admission, or they're very intent on hearing what you have to say. So feet and legs sometimes are dead giveaways. But again, you have to use everything. You're looking at the body language, you're looking at what they're saying, how they're saying it, their tone, their tonality, their feet. So you're taking kind of everything in order to make that determination when communicating with someone. Our legs reflect true emotions and intentions in real time. Unlike our face and other parts of the body, they can be instrumental in the detection of deception. For example, stress, fear, anxiety, caution, boredom, restlessness, playfulness, and anger can all manifest through the feet and legs. Again, that's something, again, to look for. And again, you can be even communicating with someone, and it's not necessarily in the interview form, but it could be someone at work. It could be even as you are trying to supervise someone, or vice versa, or it could be your boss. Again, it's something very important to take a look at. Hands. Hands are very interesting as well. For example, is that hands, if you shake hands with someone, you ever notice that someone's hand's on top? Well, if that person's hands are on top in that grip, basically that person is trying to assert dominance over you. If it's the other way around, sometimes it could be submissive. And I have some pictures here I'm going to show you in a bit. When you feel strong and confident too, the space between your fingers grows, making your hands more territorial. When you feel insecure, that space disappears. In fact, you might find yourself tucking your thumbs under your fingers when you're under a lot of stress. So stress and anxiety has a lot to do, again, biologically within your internal limbic system. Again, people are different, but these are indicators. This is biology. All right, so in this picture, for example, you have Trump and the French president. You got Trump with the hands up over his hand. So again, probably with Trump over talking to him in France, he's asserting some type of dominance. Open hands. When you see people with their hands open like that, you probably have a good opportunity to communicate with them. So anytime you see someone you're talking to and their hand gestures are open like that, they're open. So basically, they're open to maybe suggestions. They're open to possibilities. They're open in order to communicate more effectively. I wouldn't play poker with this person here. Generally speaking, when their hands are tented like that, it's a position of confidence. So for example, you're interviewing someone and you're going down a road and you're saying that, hey, I have this video. I know you were at the crime, and let's say it's a bluff. Guess what? And that person's doing that. That person's not going for anything because that person is confident that there is no video, or he had the video and destroyed it, or a whole host of other reasons. But the reality is, body language sometimes will tell you one way or the other. Again, if you look at number 6, you look where the feet are pointed. Not many people spend a lot of time looking at people's feet. You've got Ted Hill, the tilting of a head on 2, the way the legs are crossed. So again, it's very important to take a look at everything. Everyone is different. Culturally, again, it might be different on body language as well. But that's why there's no one thing that gives you have to listen to the tone, the tonality, the legs. You have to actually look at everything in the context that you're doing it. Remember what I told you before about internal representations? People have all this information going through their mind. If you get anything out of this webinar, it's important that you understand that we delete, we distort, and we generalize information all the time. And it sometimes skews us to one way or another. Again, body language with your arms crossed. I was remembering I was doing a seminar on a bunch of attorneys, and as I was sitting there, and I said, for example, what would you say to me right now when I had my arms crossed? Everyone was saying I was being deceptive, I was being closed off, because that's, again, what we're taught. But the reality is the room was 60 degrees and I was freezing. So we jump to conclusions based upon other people. For example, if one time I was talking to someone and that person was being deceptive and their arms were crossed, then I went to a training and says, oh, their arms are crossed, that means they're being deceptive. That doesn't mean every single time after that someone that crosses their arms is being deceptive. What are their words? What are their, ultimately, do their actions and words, are they congruent? That's the most important thing that you have to look for, is what are you hearing through language? Is that matching the body language and the behavior and the tone and the tonality? So it's about paying attention. It's about paying attention to everything that's going on. So what is sensory acuity? Sensory acuity is just a fancy NLP word for observation. And we all observe. We observe every day of the week. We take a look at things. We try to read things. But the idea is we don't take everything in. We're just too quick to judgment. Cognitively, we're saying, oh my God, that guy's doing that, then boom, he's deceptive. And oh, he's lying. But in order to do that, we don't spend time, especially today, because today we are so busy with technology and we're so busy about getting our posts done and trying to influence people to our world, what we want them to do right now, that we can't get to see the whole entire picture. It's about being attuned to everything in that other person's world, in that environment. And the sooner you do that, the sooner you get them to your world. So, as I had mentioned before, it's visual, hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting. It's using your senses to understand what's going on. It's about processing. Now, I can't play this video here, but if you remember the man that killed his wife and kids in Colorado, this interview, basically, you could see every indicator from his eyes to his nose to his mouth. He touches his nose a couple times when he's asked about what is going on, from where his wife is gone, where his children are gone. So it's very important that we look at everything. And again, we need to break that person down too in order for them to trust us and talk to us. Generally speaking, basically when you have your left and right eye, and I can't tell you the amount of trainings, as a young detective and young law enforcement officer that I went through. But everyone says, oh, the guy's looking up to the left. That means he's lying. He's looking up to the right. He's remembering. The reality is that if you're visualizing, it's up to the left or right. If it's auditory, it's equal. And if it's kinesthetic, it's down. Here's the difference about this, though, is that if I'm looking to the left, okay, I'm trying to visually reconstruct something, but that's only if you're left brain, right brain. So if your brain is opposite, if you're a right brain and a left brain, then you got to flip everything around. So a lot of people, I would remember going to a class, oh, the guy's looking up to the left, he's lying. Well, if he's right brain, technically he's not. So those are things that, again, they're cues. We need a lot of cues. Sometimes they're really overt. Sometimes they're very subtle. That's why looking at legs and feet sometimes helps determine that. It comes down to good listening. It definitely comes down to listening, perceiving, and hearing, and confirming and understanding. So, and it's about calibrating. When you want to calibrate someone, you have to take in the whole entire thing. And this goes for a jury too. This goes for the defense attorney. Everything that you can, because everything is people. So you want to voice, tone, and volume, the posture, facial color, eye accessing cues, the angle of the head, their breathing pattern, everything about that person you want to observe and you want to listen, because it's very important, because what you're going to take is you're going to match and mirror that same behavior in order to talk to these individuals and get them to influence them. There's a lot going on in our brain. In order to unlock it, it's very important that you actually get through it. So we talk about influence. So when we're talking about influence, we're talking about how do we influence someone. It helps to understand each individual and what is going on with them. To influence someone, you have to know what influences them. Again, very, very important that you understand what influences them. And what influences people is different for each person. Some person, for example, if you want people to have a warm, favorable opinion of them, hand them a warm cup of coffee or hot chocolate. 70% of people that you hand a warm drink to are going to have a more favorable opinion of you. Why? Biologically, you handed something to them that's warm, and they associate you being warm. Sometimes you have to reframe things and get them out of a pattern. So when we talk about a pattern and understanding people, we have to get to what interests them. We have to understand everyone from a cognitive, from a psychological perspective, from a sociological perspective. In order to do that, human needs psychology is important. For example, we all have 6 human needs. And understanding people's needs is important when you're trying to influence them. And this goes for a jury. This goes for, again, for an attorney. It goes for your children. It goes for your subordinate. It goes for your bosses. We all have human needs. We have a need for certainty because we want to experience everything and have certainty that, for example, a paycheck every 2 weeks. For example, an entrepreneur won't have a paycheck every 2 weeks because they're fighting for paycheck to paycheck. So they have a completely different need. You have the need for uncertainty because if everything was certain all the time, things would be boring. Significance is a big one. People have the need for significance to feel important. And if you understand that someone's driven by that need, if you influence that need, for example, of significance, you're able to actually get them to do what you need to do. Ultimately, what it is, it's about outcome. People have the need for connection. People have the need for growth and contribution. These are needs that we all have. Regardless of who you are, everyone wants to feel important. Everyone wants to feel loved. People want to have a house over their head. They want to have a car. They want to have the ability to go to a vacation someplace or do something different. These are all human needs. And it doesn't matter if the person's a suspect that committed a crime. People have the same needs. And I think a part of the thing is that we come in with preconceived notions and we automatically judge someone based upon that rather than take everything in. And that impedes our ability to get more information out of people. It's about developing trust. And I don't care, especially today when you're on a jury, is that we want to be trusted. We want people to believe what we're saying. So how do we influence? We find out what they want, but they aren't getting. You find out what they're dissatisfied with and change it. It's the process of getting people to associate desired feelings or state to you. This is simple. The secret how to win friends and influence people is simple. People attract to anyone that makes them feel good. Regardless of what that individual did, let's say as a suspect, regardless of the crimes, you know, how horrific, if you come in there and just come from that mindset, you're just horrific, rather than, as hard as and difficult it is, try to talk to that individual to get that information, you're not going to be able to influence them. Ultimately, our outcome in that case was a confession, especially when we're dealing with other suspects that there's victims out there. Because in order to help other victims, we need a suspect to give us as much information as humanly possible in order to aid other victims that he or she might have victimized. Rapport. I've been through a bunch of different classes, and everyone says, just get rapport, just get rapport, just get rapport. Well, rapport is power. Rapport is everything. And everyone wants to just spend 3 seconds to get rapport, but it's kind of like, you ever have the guy who comes into work and says, hey, how you doing today? And you say, hey, but I just got back. Oh, that's great. And then they walk right by. Just because you ask someone how they are doesn't mean that you're building rapport. Just because you sit next to someone, you're not building rapport. Now, there's certain things that there's commonality with rapport, but basically, it's the best way to interact with others is to establish rapport. So how do we do it? All right, first element of rapport is to match the modality. So when I was talking about auditory, visual, kinesthetic words, I'm going to match those words. For example, a good friend of mine that I work with lives in Louisiana. I talk a mile a minute. He doesn't. One day I was talking to him and I said, hey, I just had the best slice of pecan pie. And he's like, wow. I'm like, what do you mean? Thank you. Thank you for what? He said, you said pecan. I know people in the South, you can't say pecan like in New Jersey, like everyone does in New Jersey. So the funny part is that you want to match not only the modality of the rate of speech, but the words that they're using. Again, very important. Second element is mirroring that person's physiology. I'll give you an example. If you go to a restaurant tomorrow and you have someone sitting next to you, good exercise to try, and that person picks up a drink, you pick up a drink exactly as they do it. By the end of the night, every time you pick up a drink, they will pick up a drink. Again, it's about establishing rapport because people want to be liked. Inherently, people want to be liked, and they want to be with people that are basically like them. The third element, as I said, is match, before it said their tone, tempo, timbre. The fourth element is breathing. Breathing is very important. And this is what I mean for a jury. So you're like, how do you match a jury's breathing? Again, breathing is biological. So when you're matching someone's breathing, you can take a look at their shoulders. And I mean, just because if someone's hyperventilating, you're not going to go and hyperventilate. But the idea is that what you're going to do is you're going to actually match that person's shoulders as they go up and down. The idea is that by matching someone's breathing, all of a sudden you become more, you're mirroring them. Again, very important that you match someone's breathing. Again, it's biological, and try that with a jury. So look for their shoulders to go up and down. You're going to watch their shoulders go up and down. And you're going to be, again, you got a lot of stuff going on. The idea is the more you do it and the more you practice, the better you get at it. So at the same time, if I'm on a trial and I'm on a stand, I'm matching the jury because I want to be the jury's best friend. I want to talk to them, and I want the jury to think of me as not John Pizzuro, some law enforcement officer, as John Pizzuro, a person, so they can identify with me and trust me. Same thing with the defense counsel. Same thing with the prosecution. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to match even the prosecution and the defense attorney. As the defense attorney's questioning me and he's peppering me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably lower my rate of speech in order for him to come down to me in some instances. Fifth element is the pieces of information. And then the sixth element is common experiences. So everyone has commonality. So children, like if your son played baseball and you talk to someone and someone says, hey, do you have any kids? I do. I have a son. And, oh, really? Does he play any sports? He plays baseball. Boom. There's an instant commonality there. But again, you need more than just a commonality. You need to build on other things. All right. The law of proximity. So a lot of times we interview with barriers. Barriers really make it difficult in order for us to establish rapport. So the law of proximity states is that two objects side by side are better, will be perceived as a coherent object. So sitting someone next to someone side to side, it's not threatening. You can mirror them. You can take a look from your peripheral vision as their shoulders go up and down. You can match their breathing. And again, it's about establishing rapport. In order to influence someone, in order to get someone to your world, you have to spend time in their world. And sometimes that takes 30 seconds. Sometimes that takes 3 minutes. In some cases, it might take 3 hours. But the reality is, in order for you to do that, you have to spend time in their world. Another powerful thing about rapport is touch. Touch is very important. Touch, when I talked about neurotransmitters, oxytocin That's touch. Touch underlies a trust. And it doesn't matter, just a hand on the shoulder, for example. Touch underlies trust. So it actually helps. So when you're building rapport, it's very important that touch is actually good. And today we don't want to touch anyone. We're worried about touching, but a touch on the shoulder, sitting next to someone, these are just simple techniques. Matching someone's breathing, very, very important in order to influence someone. It's about developing connections. We need to connect with people. We're so busy, especially today with technology, trying to get everything done and get all the facts and move on to the next case and the next case. Our minds are so busy. We're thinking about so many different things. I'm at work. I'm thinking about at home. I'm at home. I'm thinking about work. That touch sometimes will help establish that. Getting someone out of a pattern will help get them out of that. So when I talked about matching and mirroring, it's mirroring certain behaviors of a person with whom you're interacting with. Again, it's the voice, tone, or tempo. It's matching your breathing rate, body rhythms, and body postures. Very important in order to communicate with someone. Again, it's about rapport building, mirroring, and not being obnoxious about it. If someone raises their hand and then I raise my same hand, then I'm not trying to match every single thing. But what I'm trying to do is I'm just trying to at least make that person comfortable. For example, here's a picture of two people in good rapport. And you look at their feet, you look at their facial expressions, they're laughing. An example of mirroring and matching. Again, you don't have to be exactly the same, but politicians are great at it because they're trying to elicit information, and they do it every day. They try to get people to vote for them. People that don't even like them, they just try to get them to vote for them, yet people go and vote for them. Why is that? Because they're trying to influence that person. But again, matching and mirroring. Again, same thing, especially dignitaries, CEOs, corporations. Again, another example of matching and mirroring, trying to get down there. Again, for children, getting down to their height. Now, I put this slide in here. This is a bad example of matching and mirroring. If you take a look at the gentleman, take a look at the girl's feet in pink. The girl's feet in pink, for example, look at where her legs or her feet are pointing to. Her feet are pointing to getting out of there and leaving. Look at the other thing. Even though they're looking at this as mirroring, the guy's looking down to her and tilting her head. So the body language, again, is very important. Again, matching, mirroring. If you look around, you end up seeing that a lot, especially when there's congruency. So it's about pacing and leading. So the idea is when I'm establishing rapport and I'm mirroring someone, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend time in their world. I'm going to spend time in their world before I can get them to my world. I'm going to do this by actually talking to them, spending time in their world, and I'm going to pace them. So basically, I'm talking to that individual in that individual's world, and I'm kind of pacing with him. I'm getting him to understand my world, but I'm not going to lead him to my world yet. So the idea is that I'm going to completely understand, I'm going to completely be in his world, and then at some point, dependent upon with the body language, words, I'm going to get them to my world. I have a question here is, how do you get your suspect to admit questions you are asking them when you know the answer, but you need them to confess and to admit it? So again, when you're doing that, you're spending time in that person's world in order to get them to your world. So what you're going to do is you're going to have to spend time there in order to do that. You just can't rush it. Calibration is when you know you're in rapport. So when you see the same breathing, you see the lip, their eyes, their muscles, and you see that you know in your rapport. So in the case of trying to get someone to admit something, that's your best case scenario. There's times people aren't going to admit to it because of whatever they have in a belief structure that they believe in it. So in order to do that, you have to understand, and you have to influence that person that by admitting it, it actually benefits them psychologically in any way. Now, most people will be like, oh, well, I'm going to admit to killing someone, or I'm going to admit to raping someone. But the reality is that each person's different. It depends what's going on in that circumstance. And what's depending on there is how you get them to the next spot. What you do is you do an ecology check, and you're continually checking back and forth. All right, one of the things that a good thing that you can use even with that is backtracking. Backtracking is simple. It's a review using another key, words, tone, voice, gestures, postures to summarize the discussion. So what do people like talking about more than anything else? Themselves, right? So what you need to do is you need to actually repeat their words back to them. That helps know that you're in rapport, and it helps keep you in rapport. It's used to maintain it. It can lead to clarifications. So, for example, I'll use a restaurant. So, what's your favorite type of meal? And that person says eggplant parm. And I say, wow, I had the best eggplant parm. Where'd you have it? I had it at this restaurant. Well, how did they make it? Well, they breaded it. I love breaded eggplant. Again, you're talking in those circumstances because you're backtracking and repeating the same words at them. It's not only to maintain rapport, but it's also to make sure you clarify for questions, especially when someone's being deceptive too. And they're talking about things that they did or didn't do, and sometimes that'll lead to clarification. Obviously, any good interviewer is inquisitive, observant, energetic, they're problem solving, but it's about patience. And I've seen people in interviews confess after 5 minutes and some after 5 hours. Again, everyone's different. Interviews and communication are about outcome. So what is your outcome? Is your outcome for them to admit to a crime? Is your outcome a confession? Is your outcome the way anything is done successfully is you have to determine what you want when you go in there. You know, we talk about, like in a personal development world, we talk about goal setting. But the idea is once you go in, goal setting or outcome is what do you want to come out of this? Do you want the person to confess? Do you want the person to identify a crime scene? Do you want the person to tell you where they hid the money? Do you want to? So having a defined outcome is something very important that you need to establish even before you go do an interview. It's your game plan. Some interview tips is interview and speak attentively, phrase meaningful questions, avoid monologues, stick to the point, avoid overly lengthy or repetitive statements. Don't cross-examine. Remember, report. Here's another thing, is that if you're feeling stressed or unwell, defer. If you're hurrying up to rush to do an interview because you have to do the interview, have someone else do the interview. Again, people can sense can sense different things that are going on with you. And be aware if your mind is jumping to conclusions. Be attentive to inconsistency and maintain congruency. Some other suggestions: leaning in slightly, keeping eye contact, again, giving signals that express understanding. I mean, these are more than things that we do on a daily basis, but again, I'm just going over a couple of them. Barriers, like I said, our stress level. When we're experiencing more personal work-related stressors, we may be more likely to misread other people's messages, and we're sending the wrong signal. Let's think about, let's say in a homicide that you just worked 40 hours straight and you finally got the guy, and now you're about to go do the interview. It's going to be kind of difficult when you've just worked 40 hours straight. Our well-being, if we're not feeling well physically or emotionally, it's about being at our optimum level. If we're distracted by our thoughts and our environment. So the quality of our lives, I put this slide in every presentation I do, boils to the quality of questions we ask. Is this the best we can do? How did you get started? What's good about this problem or situation? It's the way we phrase it and the way we go into an interview and the way we, our plan is what establishes what's going on with the other person a lot of times. So when it comes down to testimony, it's the same thing. So when we're in court, for example, our demeanor in our testimony and our psychological welfare, for example, is important. How we present ourselves on a jury. I know a lot of prosecutors don't like officers in uniform. Some do like officers in uniform. I know that I've testified before, and I've testified in a shirt and tie, but not with a super short haircut. It's about relating to people, and it's about the jury. It's about the defense attorney. You got to remember, trial is about a game. And attorneys win their cases sometimes not on the evidence, but on their openings and closings. It's about the believability factor of the people that are there in the courtroom. Just real quick, because we only got about a couple minutes left. Depositions, stay calm, don't be bullied. Again, remember, in any of these case scenarios, you're in control. Your response, the way you act, you're in charge. Testifying grand jury, keep to the facts. When testifying, lean slightly towards grand jurors. Avoid distracted mannerisms while testifying. Don't exaggerate or guess. And simply, when you're in trial and you're being asked a question, I don't know, ask them to repeat that. It's very, very, very important. Just remember, jury trials are about the jury. You want to anticipate your tone. Again, your tone and tonality. Now, when the prosecutor or the defense attorney is trying to bait you in a corner, there's things that you can do. One, you could say, don't just repeat the question. I don't understand what you're saying. But when you're doing that, look to the jury. Lower your tone. Watch your mannerisms. Speak to the jury. Match their breathing through the shoulders. Rate of speech, very important. Is that when don't get upset. Got to remember, it's a game. The defense attorney is going to come out there and he's going to try to make you not liked. That's the bottom line. Your job is to make sure that everyone likes you, including the defense attorney. And again, it's about reading a jury. It's about picking that jury beforehand. One of the things that I love doing is actually picking a jury. But again, you're going to look at everyone. You're going to think of that person as your grandmother on the stand, your best friend. People on that stand, people in the jury room aren't, let's say, for example, law enforcement, and you are law enforcement. So they're going to have a different belief system. And remember, when I was talking about NLP and talking about the internal representations, their belief structure is going to be different. They're going to delete, distort, and generalize what you say, what information's there. It's common among every person. So the idea is that you need to relate to that jury, and there's ways to do it, and that's building rapport. Again, you're going to tilt their head at the same thing while looking at eye contact with one juror. You are going to keep a soft tone if that soft tone is a person. So the idea is that you can still match and mirror that jury. Again, it's about the jury. Build rapport with the jury and keep congruence. So as I open this up to questions in 1 minute, here are the classes for that are being taught. And it's a 2-day class. And again, I get into more specifics. We do exercises on pacing and leading, on backtracking. I have people do exercises on auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. The idea is that you're able to determine that through other people. Again, I gave you a lot here in an hour and 15 minutes that normally takes like even 2-3 days in order to do. But with that, I'll open it up to, I guess, some questions that I have here.
And John, this is Catherine here. I actually have some questions as well. So do you want to start with what you're looking at, and then I can come in behind you?
Sure. I just have one more question. It says, what are some great education sources to learn about visual cognitive interview interpretations, body language? There's a lot. You could search, you can even search articles on neurolinguistic programming. Cognitive interview interpretations, I would go into more like maybe a trauma-based interview if you just research that. There's some good resources involving that. Basically how the brain actually works and it determines memory and recall. That's another thing that that you're able to determine. A lot of the information that I have, I've been able to be friends with and trained by a couple good neuroscientists in the New York City area that basically taught me a lot about this. So.
All right, I've got several here. Is there any value behind, and I hope I'm going to say this word correctly, oculesics, specifically left side lie, or would you caution against this?
I would caution against this because, again, there's too much going on. Because if I go and I tell everyone in an audience, and usually I have everyone fold their thumbs. This is a good indicator. Half the audience will have their thumb folded over the right, over the left, and left over the right. So half your people are going to be completely different. So that's why I caution against anything. There's basically not one specific thing you should ever use. It just should be something that just makes it interesting to you to further examine through other means.
All right. In an interview setting for a criminal offense, there is debate within this person's agency whether or not to use a metal folding chair or an upholstered cushioned chair for the suspect. Of course, they're sitting in an office-type desk chair. What is your opinion on this issue?
The more comfortable the person is, the more likely you're able to establish rapport. I personally wouldn't use a metal chair. That's just me, but that doesn't mean it necessarily doesn't work. I probably wouldn't be in front of a desk. I would be more to the side of him when I'm conducting that, or in front of him without a desk. But ultimately, it's probably better off to use the same type of chair for everyone. That's how I would do it. So, because just having different chairs for different things just makes it, someone walking in and he sees 3 chairs, he'll see 3 chairs, and if one's different and he's sitting in the cushion one and you're sitting in the middle one or vice versa, again, it doesn't help establish rapport because that person's looking at why are there different chairs and why is he sitting in that chair, and now he's thinking about chairs rather than thinking about what you're talking to.
All right, thank you. Good answer there. During an interview, a subject begins pacing. Should you stop them pacing and have them sit for the remainder of the interview?
It depends. It depends on what information is being said, and is the person starting to pace because he's getting close to admission? Is he nervous? Sometimes letting that pacing, that nervous energy is might an indicator. You might need a pattern interrupt. So sometimes maybe you could stand up with that person, maybe put your arm on his shoulder. Is everything okay? And then one of those terms in order to break them out of that pattern to sit down. It's kind of a little difficult for me to answer that because there's so many other factors going on and I don't know what's going on, whether with the information, but that's something that I would do is that as far as pacing, you might want to control that a little, or you can get up and pace with them. Sometimes that interrupts their pattern. What you want to do is really interrupt their pattern in order to get them back there. So again, I hope that answered your question.
All right. Is strategic deception during an interrogation all right if employed after a suspect voluntarily waives his rights to an attorney and to remain silent?
Who's being strategic? You being deceptive, the interviewer or the interviewee?
Well, here's hoping whoever asked the question is still listening and they can chat that to us. Do you want to answer it as if it's first one and then the other?
So, okay. Best case scenario in that instance is that it's fine if the person already confessed and you're still continuing with that. You're still fine. I would still do that.
Okay. How about this? How do you manage the loss due to language barrier, even when using interpreters during interviews?
That's tough. There, you're going to have to look at more body language because still, even though it's a different language barrier, that person is still going to be more auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, so that's that interpreter. Then what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to rely on more cognitive stuff, whether it be cultural or some belief or values. So the thought process there is that you're going to have to just relate to that person in a different way. Language is difficult when it's lost, but don't forget it's only 7% of communication. You still can try to match the tone and tonality in those circumstances. Even though it's a different language, you can keep the same tone. You can lower your rate of speech or speed it up. The words are going to be just different.
Is there a particular style of dress that works best? This person is a plainclothes special agent with a short haircut. Do I need to wear a suit or coat and tie to testify, or would just business casual suffice?
I would probably, business casual would be perfect. When you're wearing a tie from your body language standpoint, a lot of times, it depends on what town and where you are. Where are the people coming from? Where's the jury pool coming from? Because that really answers the question of what you're going to wear. A lot of times I like to wear, even in meetings, is a suit jacket and business casual, only because it just doesn't keep me as stuffy, and it kind of relaxes that. And even though I have a short haircut, the idea is that will help in those instances. It's again how you try to relate to those people. It depends. If people, if the normal attire in some place is overalls, and you come, for example, in a shirt and tie and spit shine shoes, again, you want to try to how would you, if you went to this person's, this is a good way to answer this. If you went to a person's family event, what is that family event? What do they normally wear? How do they normally act? You want to try to do that while still retaining your professional professional decorum, if that makes sense.
All right, John, what do you do in order to introduce Miranda after the interview, but before the transition to the interrogation phase? What are some best practices?
Best practices for me as far as Miranda, most of the rapport I establish beforehand. When they go into an interview room, they're already Mirandized, and I already Mirandize them. After I had already established rapport and to come down and sit there and talk to them, generally speaking, if people are already coming back with me and they're going to talk to me, that's the first thing that usually I do, but it's usually after it's established rapport and then they're inside the station, because obviously we don't have to, I have the car ride, I have some of the other places to doing, dependent upon if that person's under arrest or that the person's a suspect. So if the person's a suspect, he will come there, he'll talk, he's free to leave, he wants to talk a little bit more, depending upon where the interview is. Here in the East Coast where we are, we record everything. So we have electronic recordation. So we'll establish Miranda within that interview all the time.
All right. Any suggestions for rapport establishing and mirroring with a young adult or juvenile with a parent and or a legal guardian in the interview room as well?
Okay, yeah, I mean, because it's subtle. Parent and the guardian's not going to even realize you're doing that. And a lot of people don't, because it's not obnoxious, it's subtle. And that's the idea, is to keep it subtle. If anything, the parent or juvenile is going to, or the parent or the guardian of the juvenile is going to let their guard down a little bit more. So what I would do is, for example, if it's a child, and like I had showed the one picture of sitting down, if you're sitting down side by side to the child, and there's not a barrier, and the adult is in the room, and you're kind of matching some of that language, and you're matching the tone and tonality, the person and the parent is not going to pick that up. 90% and 99% of people don't actually pick up it's even happening, because it's biological and we're automatically liked.
All right. Should we still mirror if the interviewee is angry or agitated?
No. So in those cases, if it's angry or it's yelling or shouting, we're not going to match the yelling and shouting, because when that person's irritated, they're in a pattern in their brain. It's kind of like a record player. So as the record player goes, it's going to keep going around. You need to skip that in order to get to the next track. That's where touch, some pattern interrupts, and in the 2-day class, I go into pattern interrupts, how to get someone off a pattern in order to get them to come back to you.
All right, so back to the question that we had with respect to the language barrier, and here's the question, and they had another comment. So the question was, how do you manage the loss due to language barrier even when using interpreters during interviews? And then they came back and added communication loss, meaning of words, emphasis of words, tone of voice used on words you don't know the meaning of, but you can still hear.
It's tough because you have a language barrier. I mean, the best you can do is, again, their words. See, the difference is if you have a translator, it's very difficult because that translator is going to have his own interpretation of whatever dialect it is, because I believe there's, 4,000 different languages around the world and dialects. So to answer your question, the short answer is going to be extremely difficult to do. The best you can do is just try to come up with universal words that kind of mean something in every culture. I know that doesn't help you much, but it's kind of hard to do, via a webinar in context without completely seeing it.
Okay, can you provide any tips on establishing a better rapport with a suspect when they have an attorney present with them for questioning and they are already on edge?
You're going to, again, report tips. Again, matching and mirroring, the breathing, and especially with that attorney. That attorney, I'm going to make my best friend. That attorney, I'm going to match and mirror. I'm going Ask questions. Here's the thing that we don't do enough is we don't ask questions. And it's okay to ask personal questions like, what do you like to do? Because it keeps people unguarded. More than just the weather. We want to right away get into the questions that we need to ask. But in order to do that, we need to establish that rapport. So what I would do in those circumstances, in order to make that person feel comfortable, is find common experiences that you can relate to, your attorney can relate to, that you can talk about that to calm that person down.
All right, and this last question that I have is pretty much the same as the first, but it's worth repeating here. Are there any good resources or some of your favorite sources for the research for someone who wants to dig deeper into the topics of reframing and cognitive interviewing?
I would, again, neurolinguistic programming, NLP, there's a lot of good books. I think the easiest book to understand about NLP was, believe it or not, written in 1984 by Anthony Robbins. I forget the name of the title. But if you search NLP, you search cognitive interviewing, again, there's going to be a whole bunch of different ones out there. For my research and most of the things that I have, it's more or less trauma-based, how the brain interacts, cognitive interviewing. There are no clear-cut great examples that I have. There's really a mesh of a lot of things, but I would probably say Anthony Robbins, if you're looking for just to learn more about NLP, and just basically Bandler and Grinder are the two people that created NLP. So if you look at any of those books and some of those older books, Tad James has a lot of resources as well for NLP. You might be able to find and download some stuff over the internet even that they might have, just to go into more about the deletion, distortion, and generalization. So if you probably just Google delete, distort, generalize, or communication meta model, some of that stuff will give you some of that information and resources.
All right, we actually had two more come in real quick. What do you do when you try to build rapport and the suspect dismisses it and wants to get straight to the point of why they are there?
Did you really try to establish rapport? That's my question number one. People don't want to be there, and especially if I'm guilty, I want to know where everything is about. So again, I'm going to try to spend time talking about other things. I'm going to they're in a pattern, so I got to get them out of the pattern. And what I'm talking about today, none of this is easy. There is no clear-cut answer that if you do this, this will happen. That's what makes what we do interesting, I would say, and difficult, is that there is no short answer to that. But those are the things that I would do. I would get that person out of that pattern. I would use touch. I would try to match breathing. I would try maybe to sit side by side. The idea of NLP is about flexibility. It's that if something doesn't work, then try something else. What I'm giving you is a lot of different things to try, and not everything's going to work with every person.
All right, John, thank you. I'm going to give you a special thank you for a very informative and interesting webinar. Just a reminder, everybody, if you missed the announcement at the beginning, everyone who registered for this event will receive an email with the link to the recording. You will receive the link after the recording has been rendered, usually within a few days after the live event. Once we receive the webinar attendance report, we will mark you passed, and your certificate of attendance will be available to you on your NW3C profile. We thank you for attending. Be sure to visit our website at nw3c.org for more webinar and training opportunities. And this concludes our program for today. Thank you so much.